One of the great privileges in my life has been to have a close collegial relationship with the anthropologist Alan Young. And when he came to McGill, we began a process of meeting regularly to talk about our shared interests. At the time, he was working on his book, The Harmony of Illusions, which was a very important ethnography of the emergence of the construct of post-traumatic stress disorder within the American Veterans Administration system. And for me, this was a kind of a process of being drawn into a set of issues surrounding the whole construct of trauma that was extremely interesting for me, partly because I was trained in an era when the idea of trauma was not central to psychiatry. And we looked at mood disorders and psychoses and anxiety and so on, but trauma was not in the foreground, at least in the way that I was being trained. And that was part of a social process that went on in the 70s and 80s where trauma became extremely central to public discourse, attached to a recognition of dissociative disorders and a whole set of issues. So Alan, to some degree, was writing about this because of the role that attention to trauma played in the whole political and moral negotiation of the meaning of the suffering of Vietnam veterans who were returning from a very unpopular war, who had multiple problems sometimes related to what they'd experienced there, sometimes pre-existing, around substance use, around personality issues, around a whole host of issues. And Alan sort of saw how this complex mix of issues that people had was being configured and shaped in a certain way by a very powerful cultural environment and a set of economic constraints. I mean, the program he described, which was a model program for the development of the diagnosis and approach to trauma in the U.S., was structured such that if you could get through the treatment program and learn to narrate your suffering in a particular way, you could come out of that with a lot of financial compensation for your disability. So there was a very powerful social contingency, in a sense, a kind of reward for learning to frame your problem a certain way. So it was a striking example, maybe a little bit different than some of the everyday things that we saw. But it started a long conversation and a lot of work around the question of trauma. And one of the things that fed into that, so Alan had this interest and it caused me to think more about what I was seeing and different patients and situations I was working in. But another major thing that happened related to that, first thing that happened related to that was we were both invited to a conference that was organized by Anthony Marcella, a cultural psychologist in Hawaii, with other people from the VA system who were working on post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we went to this meeting in Hawaii, and Alan was there, myself and Arthur Kleinman, and it was to talk about trauma, and we were specifically writing about questions of culture and trauma. And so we saw right away the dilemmas between the kind of mainstream approach to trauma. Matthew Friedman, who was the head of the White River Junction VA system at the time, which again was a model or central program in the development of trauma treatments and so on, said at that meeting, the great thing about PTSD is it's the only psychiatric disorder for which we have an animal model. And what he meant was, if you shock a rat in a cage, the rat develops this fear response, this conditioned fear response, and that is a behavioral and biological analog of human PTSD. So the problem for those of us who are clinicians or those of us who are more socially oriented was, yes, okay, well, that's a strand, that's a piece. We have something like that. If you get, if you have that kind of injury and fear and whatever, yes, you'll develop some conditioned fear. When I go to the dentist and the light comes on, I sometimes squint and can't keep my eyes open because I'm anticipating what a fun time I'm going to have with the dentist. But that's only a small piece of the complex set of issues and problems and struggles of veterans, so it seems very inadequate. So this trying to lay out what this larger picture was became very important. Around the same time, David Spiegel, who was a psychiatrist, son of a famous psychiatrist, Herbert Spiegel, who had developed during the Second World War, developed the use of hypnosis for the treatment of shell shock and so on, or war-related trauma at the time. David Spiegel held a conference funded by a MacArthur network on dissociation. And again, we have this discussion around, because this is also the time when multiple personality disorder was becoming a popular diagnosis. We had an epidemic of people with multiple personalities, and not only one or two, like it had been the case for 100 years. Occasional cases. Suddenly, it was people with 50 personalities or 100 personalities. I mean, just totally boggled the mind. I mean, I can't even describe 50 different personalities, let alone have them internally. But anyway. So there was a whole set of issues going on there, and of thinking about how culture shaped, the social world shaped people's experience of trauma, their expression in different forms, including these dissociative phenomena, which are so interesting. And then, so we had these ongoing discussions and had done some work around this and thought about this in relation to some of the traumatized people. We saw the most clearly traumatized being refugees who had really come from places of the world where they experienced terrible violence, experienced torture, and so on. And then a great opportunity occurred in the form of a workshop organized by an anthropologist, Robert Lemelson, at University of California, Los Angeles. And he brought together a group of people. He had, because he was independently wealthy, not independently wealthy, he inherited great wealth, which really happened when he was already in graduate school, becoming an anthropologist. He decided to use some of those resources to create a foundation called the Foundation for Psychocultural Research, to try to foster research and training at the intersection of psychology, mental health, developmental psychology, and anthropology. His first love and commitment was to anthropology, especially psychological anthropology, but he was very interested to try to bring those perspectives to bear on issues like mental health. So he invited about 20 or 30 people to a retreat, included Byron Good and Mary Jo Good and many other people, and I was invited to that, to plan what this foundation would do. And the decision that came out of that was that the first 5 years of the foundation would be supporting a training program, an interdisciplinary training program, but it would also develop a conference on trauma. So that eventually led to a very interesting meeting in which anthropologists were invited alongside psychiatrists and psychologists, clinical psychiatrists and psychologists, alongside neuroscientists and psychologists doing animal research. So you had three very different traditions and styles even of discourse side by side, all being treated very nicely by this foundation, so they're encouraged to sit there and pay attention to each other. And it was actually almost hilarious in some sense, because we know the very big differences in style. So the psychologists got up and did presentations with beautiful PowerPoint slides with embedded films of rats and Skinner boxes and beautiful bar graphs with error bars and everything, and presented their studies. And the anthropologists got up and leaned over and read their papers, without looking up the whole time. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but almost that bad. And the psychiatrists got up and put their knee on the podium and told stories about patients that they saw. So three totally different styles, but also underneath it, really even different epistemologies, you could say, to some degree. So it's quite a challenge sometimes, because whether each group felt the other had anything interesting to say, or whether what they said was credible or not, whether they were presenting things in a way that should be given, was a big challenge. Importantly, I would say at this meeting, there was also a decision at the very beginning of the meeting to have a panel in which survivors of terrible violence talked. So it began with a panel of people that included a survivor of the Khmer Rouge, of Pol Pot, a survivor of Rwandan genocide, and I think the third one I can't remember. I think maybe Vietnamese. I actually don't remember. But anyway, the point was that these three people told very personal, very detailed stories. They were accustomed to doing this. They were chosen because they were comfortable doing some of this and telling the story. But the story they told was not a story of PTSD. So even though, yes, I feel jittery and sometimes I have nightmares, and the stories where I'm really concerned that my children get into a good school, and I'm really frustrated with my professional credentials not being recognized in where I'm living now, or I'm really bothered by the discrimination in this society. So very everyday real world issues that were about going forward, not about reliving the trauma in the past, even though they certainly had the scars of that. So that's how the book began. And the book ended up having 3 sections. It was co-edited by myself along with Rob Lemelson, an anthropologist, and Mark Barad, a neuroscientist. So it had those 3 elements in it. It had 3 sections, but the goal was to make them talk to each other to some degree. I don't know how well we did that, but there they were side by side, being given equal weight, and saying that, the anthropologist Leslie Dwyer and Dagung Santa Carmen's account of trauma in Bali from a cultural point of view was just as important as, Mark Fancelow's discussion of animals' fear and avoidance systems and how those work over time. So that was an interesting message, an aspiration. The last chapter that we wrote, the first chapter was about the history of trauma and the emergence of trauma as a common trope for many things and what that meant from a sort of critical perspective. The last chapter is titled something like The Vicissitudes of Interdisciplinary Collaboration, or whatever. Just talked about these different styles and when they could or could not speak to each other. So that was an important step, and I should say that that foundation has continued to support our work up to the present. And there were subsequent books that came out of that work, but maybe I'll talk about that a bit more later in another context. As I mentioned, trauma became increasingly central to a lot of our discussions, partly because many of us were involved with some work with refugees, and also because of an interest in global mental health. So our close colleague Duncan Peterson, originally trained as a pediatrician and public health specialist, trained as an anthropologist, who was born in Argentina, worked in Brazil, in Peru, lived and worked in Brazil and Peru, and then came here and worked closely at the Douglas Hospital Research Center with Ellen Corin, with Gilles Bibot, with others. Was very connected. He'd worked in international agencies in Canada and was very connected with the funding agencies that support international work and was determined to advance that work. So we had a series of projects that he led or facilitated, enabled to happen really through funding, his efforts in grant writing and funding and so on, and his vision of how that could go forward. And that included collaborations in Brazil, where Gilles Bibot also had many connections. Gilles, who's a polyglot and who could teach in Portuguese as well as Spanish and French and English and several African languages. So Brazil and Chile and other places. And then Duncan there was a Teasdale-Cordy grant program that was a kind of collaboration between CHR and I think IDRC. And he got a large grant, together we all got this grant, on looking at trauma across culture. And the goal was to really do training and development in different societies that had both natural disasters and civil violence, to give them the tools to do their own qualitative research to inform their response to trauma. Because, as you know, trauma became an industry. I mean, Didier Fessin and Richard Reshman wrote in L'Empire de Trauma, the Empire of Trauma. We just ended up with a huge devouring kind of monster of trauma that just ate up all kinds of issues. And that became the way to have your problem taken seriously, was to call it trauma. And this was a problem internationally because, I mean, it's part of, as Mel Connor, the anthropologist, pointed out in our book on trauma, the human condition is one in which we've always been exposed to trauma. We've always had violent death. We've always had, catastrophes. It stands to reason we have some ways of adapting and surviving that. We're not totally, without resources. But what was happening in different parts of the world was when there was a trauma, the International Trauma Brigade would descend with their clipboards and their treatments and provide help, except that they also made huge demands on the community. So there were a lot of concerns about how a one-size-fits-all model to trauma was not necessarily doing well by everyone, in particular not fitting very well with local values and understandings of the person, and making optimal use of local resources. So we situated ourselves in relation to that. We drew in partners that we had. For example, the summer school that we started, the second year of that summer school, psychiatrist Bogendra Sharma came from Nepal, from Kathmandu, to take part in our summer school. And he was the founder and director of the Center for Treatment of Victims of Torture in Kathmandu. In fact, he published an article in our journal called Treatment of Torture in something, I forget, something about torture survivors in Nepal, a country that practices torture. And I asked him if he was sure he wanted to use that title, because it sounds like a pretty confrontational title. And he said, well, in fact, all sides in the conflict were using torture, and he was helping all sides from a health point of view. So yes, we could just say what it was, and the point was, from a human rights point of view, connected to the International Rehabilitation Council in Copenhagen, trying to push back against the use of torture. In any event, what we did when this grant opportunity happened was we invited him in. So we ended up with a grant that enabled us to work in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Guatemala, and Peru. With the idea these are all societies, very different cultures, all societies we had a connection to, so we're not going naively, that there already were links. In the case of Sri Lanka, we worked with Suman Fernando, a British cultural psychiatrist who's from Sri Lanka and who was very well connected there. In Nepal, it was through our colleague Bogendra Sharma. In Guatemala, it was through Victor Lopez, a psychiatrist, and in Peru through the Center for the National Institute of Mental Health that we had already done workshops with and had collaborators there. So there were natural connections, so it wasn't so far-fetched to have so many different groups, and the argument was these are all societies that have had both political violence and natural disasters. They're all societies that have been the recipient of lots of resources to try to address trauma, but very little work to say, well, what's distinctive, what's culturally grounded, what are our particular needs and understanding. So we were able, over a course of 5+ years really, to visit all these places, to do workshops there, to have a small grant program to support students to do research, to train people in ethnographic methods and the McGill Illness Narrative Interview, and so on, and to have some students come here and actually do both short-term summer school work but also advanced graduate work. So one of my students that came out of that program is Ram Sapkota, a psychologist who went on to do a PhD with me, postdoc here with Alain Brunet, who studies PTSD, and they actually did a clinical trial of reconsolidation therapy in Nepal, and Ram has now gone on to be a researcher at the University of Saskatchewan in doing work in health. One of the projects that we did with Ram was to look at the experience of possession experiences of pathological possession among school-aged children in Nepal. In fact, that's what he did for his PhD, because there have been many episodes of kids who suddenly get possessed and fall to the ground in the middle of the classroom and are writhing around, speaking in guttural tones, and it's very disruptive to the class, and the classes and the schools are upset, and the schools have reached out to the NGOs that are providing trauma work related to civil violence or the earthquake or whatever, and so it became a challenge to say, well, what's the right way to respond? So we were able to do some interesting work, both quantitative work, trying to look at correlates, who's vulnerable to these things, ethnographic work. We have some interesting film, like maybe I can show a clip of that, of people experiencing these kinds of possession, pathological possession experiences, and trying to make sense of what the contributors are to this. That's related to other work. One of my postdoctoral fellows, Rebecca Seligman, is somebody who, in her PhD and subsequent work, studied candomblé and in Brazil. So in this case, we're not talking about pathological possession or trance. We're talking about deliberate, positive, religious, sought-after experiences of getting possessed as a form of worship, as a form of celebration, as a form of edification for people. So she's also tried to bring a biosocial approach to that, both looking at people's life histories and what led them to have those kinds of experiences, but also doing psychophysiological measures and so on. And together we've written about an approach to try to understand trauma response, but also dissociation as not only a trauma response. That is to say, not everybody who gets possessed has had a bad life experience. It can be a recreational activity. It can be just a spiritual activity that you try to cultivate in some ways. So figuring out what the interplay is between adverse life events, emotional distress, and positive life events, and cultural forms that encourage people to, as Erica Bourguignon years ago sort of, tracked in a series of papers that were organized by the R.M. Buck Society for Religious Experience, Study of Religious Experience that my predecessor Ray Prince created. She tracked the very wide prevalence of trance and possession experiences around the world. So we know that these are extremely common, usually not pathological. And one of the interesting questions is why in North American psychiatry or Western psychiatry in general has this been framed very much as, it's a problem, it's a pathological problem, it's hysteria, it's trauma related, it's something else, rather than saying, well, this is actually a capacity that human beings have to become deeply absorbed, to become engaged in culturally scripted imaginings or alternative modes of experiencing the self that need to be taken seriously. And I should mention that this is something then Tanya Luhrmann has taken up from her own angle, looking at, first of all, what she calls the sort of the kindling of experience, the ways in which people actually try to practice invoking hearing voices or feeling a presence or so on as part of spiritual practice, and to understand how that can be used in a way as part of both individual adaptation and as the work of culture, what L.B. Essiker called the work of culture. So this work on trauma then has led us in a couple of directions. This led us in the direction of trying to understand the nature of dissociative experience, which like amnesia and multiple personality and trance and possession experiences, and trying to understand them, first of all, from a non-pathological point of view as common events and practices that occur, but that then intersect in some ways with, can intersect with people experiencing violence or painful experiences that they're trying to manage in some way. It's also led us in the direction of trying to understand how people recover from painful experiences like this. So back to the theme of resilience again, and there's overlap between this idea of trauma and the experience of Indigenous people. So in recent years, many Indigenous people have come to frame their collective history in terms of the idea of historical trauma, the idea that there was, collective violence perpetrated against Indigenous people, which included violent death, but also cultural suppression, all these other things, and that altogether this forms a kind of violence against the collective that could be called historical trauma. And in fact, this very idea was borrowed from trauma studies, and particularly from ideas about the Holocaust, because Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who promoted this idea, was trained at Columbia University in social work in a department that was already very engaged with the experiences of Holocaust survivors and how to understand that, and second and third generation. But when we look at the kinds of experiences Indigenous people have faced, a simple trauma model, again, the stripped-down model of PTSD, doesn't come close to capturing what people are experiencing, not only because of the many levels and facets of it, but also because it's not just about something that happened at one point in time in the past, but it's about ongoing structural disadvantage and structural violence. So the Indigenous psychologist Joe Gahn and I and others have written about this, the dilemmas of this way of framing Indigenous problems, what you gain and what you lose when you characterize large social problems in terms of a trope like trauma, which I think is, again, some of the work that anthropologists, social scientists, philosophers, historians have done in trying, starting with Alan Young and many other and several others, trying to unpack what we're doing when we call something trauma and what it reveals and what it hides as a way of framing experience. Finally, I'd say that applies very much to our attempts to understand the nature of refugees' experience. When refugees come from far away parts, so we live in Canada. This is our everyday life here. It's a very, what can we say, a remarkably placid, quiet place compared to most corners of the world. We only have to look south of the border to see kind of the Wild West, going on in terms of the level of gun violence in the United States, or the places that we worked in different parts of the world. So one of the problems we have here in our work with refugees is what we've called failures of imagination, that people can't really conceive of the kinds of dilemmas and the kinds of violence that people are escaping from, trying to come to terms with. So trying to understand what kind of background knowledge, what kind of shared narratives have to be circulating in our society to enable people to tell their story of trauma. So that's been one of my interests, is the idea that if we can tell the story of trauma, have it witnessed, have it understood, then we can perhaps deal with it better. But to do that, we have to have the people that are listening to us have to have some background knowledge. Otherwise, it's too big a burden for us to have to convey our story to them. So it's a kind of shift in perspective a bit. That, and some of this articulated in this book that Paul Lancy and Michael Lambeck did on called Tense Past, which is a symposium that we organized at the Society for Psychological Anthropology, where Ian Hacking gave a memorable talk, and where many of us were able to begin to grapple with this idea of the politics of memory, the cultural politics of memory, and how that impacts on everyday experience of people who experience trauma, that including refugees and indigenous people and so on.